The cantina on Kepler Station was always dark and smoky. Commander Zex Thara liked it that way. The old Catherian warrior sat alone at his usual table in the far corner, where the shadows were deepest. His 4 arms rested on the metal surface, each one bearing scars from battles fought across the galaxy. Tonight, like most nights, he drank alone. The whiskey burned as it went down. It was real Terran whiskey, expensive and hard to find this far from Earth. But Zex Thara had developed a taste for human alcohol during the war. It was one of the few things from that time he could still stomach. 3 young Coalition soldiers walked into the cantina. They wore fresh uniforms with shiny badges. Zex Thara could smell their nervousness from across the room. They were new. Recruits, probably fresh out of training. Their eyes swept the dim room until they spotted him. "That's him," one of them whispered. "That's Commander Zex Thara." The Catherian's hearing was excellent. He heard every word. He took another drink and hoped they would leave him alone. They didn't. The 3 soldiers approached his table slowly. The leader was a young human female with short blonde hair. Behind her stood a tall Zilonian with blue skin and a nervous-looking Mantari, whose insect-like features twitched with excitement. "Commander Zex Thara," the human said. "My name is Lieutenant Kelly Brooks. These are my squad mates. We were wondering if we could buy you a drink and hear some stories from the Syndicate Wars." Zex Thara looked up at them with his dark eyes. His face was scarred and weathered, marked by decades of fighting. "I don't tell war stories," he said in his deep voice. "Please, sir," the Zilonian said. "We're being deployed to the Outer Rim next month. The veterans all say you fought with the humans during the worst battles. We just want to know what to expect." The old warrior stared at them for a long moment. Then he gestured to the empty chairs around his table. "Sit down. Buy your own drinks, and don't expect heroic tales." The 3 young soldiers sat down quickly. They ordered drinks from the serving robot and waited. Zex Thara finished his whiskey and poured another from the bottle on the table. "You want to know about fighting with humans?" he said finally. "Then you need to understand something first. Humans don't fight wars the way other species do. They don't follow the rules." Lieutenant Brooks leaned forward. "What do you mean, sir?" Zex Thara was quiet for a moment. His mind went back 20 years to his first assignment with a human unit. He could still remember the smell of smoke and burning metal on Vega Prime. "I was assigned to Captain Jake Morrison's unit during the siege of Vega Prime," he began. "The Syndicate had taken the planet 6 months earlier. Our job was simple: land, fight, liberate the colony. Standard military operation." He took another drink. The whiskey was starting to work its way through his system. "Morrison was not what I expected from a human officer. He was quiet, thoughtful. While other species would study battle plans and weapon specifications, Morrison studied something else entirely." "What did he study?" the Montari asked, his voice clicking through his translator. "The enemy," Zex Thara said. "But not their tactics or their technology. He studied them, who they were, what they believed, what they feared." The old warrior's eyes grew distant as he remembered. There was an intelligence officer in Morrison's unit. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, small human female, looked harmless. She spent weeks going through captured Syndicate communications, not looking for military secrets, looking for personal messages. "Personal messages?" Brooks asked. "Letters to families, complaints about food, worries about home." Rodriguez collected thousands of these messages. She studied them like a scholar studies ancient texts. She wanted to understand how Syndicate soldiers thought. Zex Thara paused to drink. The 3 young soldiers waited patiently. "I asked Morrison why his intelligence officer was wasting time on such things. He looked at me with those calm human eyes and said something I will never forget. He said, 2. Defeat monsters. You have to understand what made them monsters in the first place. The Zolonian soldier shifted uncomfortably. That sounds reasonable, sir. Does it? Zexthara's voice was sharp. Let me tell you what happened next. The Syndicate had fortified positions all around the main colony. Strong defenses. Heavy weapons. According to our battle computers, a direct assault would cost us 60% casualties. He poured more whiskey. His hands were steady, but his eyes held old pain. Morrison didn't order a direct assault. Instead, he had Rodriguez broadcast personal messages over Syndicate communication. Channels, messages from captured soldiers to their families. Messages about homesickness and fear and doubt. Psychological warfare, Brooks said quietly. No, Zexthara said firmly. What other species call psychological warfare is crude. Threats and propaganda. What the humans did was different. They made the enemy soldiers remember they were people. The cantina seemed quieter now. Other patrons had left or moved to distant tables. The three young soldiers listened intently as the old warrior continued. Within 3 days, the Syndicate's defensive positions began to weaken. Not because of weapons or tactics, but because their soldiers were thinking about home. Thinking about whether the war was worth dying for. Thinking about their families. Zexthara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. And while they were thinking, Morrison's unit moved in. Not with guns blazing like heroes in the stories. They moved quietly, carefully. They spoke to enemy soldiers in their own languages. They offered them chances to surrender, to go home to their families. Did it work? Half the Syndicate garrison surrendered without firing a shot. The other half fought, but their hearts weren't in it. Morrison's unit took the colony with less than 5% casualties. The Mentari's antennae twitched nervously. That sounds like good tactics, sir. Why do you seem troubled by it? Zexthara was quiet for a long time. He stared into his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. Because I realized something that night, he said finally. Other species fight wars to win or lose. Humans fight wars to change their enemies forever. They don't just want victory. They want to make sure their enemies can never be the same again. He looked up at the three young soldiers. And that is only the beginning of what I learned about human warfare. The dark truth goes much deeper than simple tactics. The old warrior finished his drink and stood up slowly. Come back tomorrow night if you want to hear more. But understand this. Once you know the truth about how humans fight wars, you will never see them the same way again. He walked away, leaving the three young soldiers sitting in stunned silence at the empty table. The next evening, the three young soldiers returned to the cantina. They found Commander Zexthara at the same table, with the same bottle of Terran whiskey. This time, they didn't hesitate to approach. Lieutenant Kelly Brooks sat down first, followed by her 2 squad mates. The old Catherian warrior looked at them with tired eyes. You came back, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, Brooks replied. We need to know more. Zexthara poured himself another drink. The bottle was already half empty. What I told you yesterday was just the beginning. The humans I fought with during the Syndicate Wars did things that still keep me awake at night. The Zolonian soldier leaned forward. What kind of things, sir? Things that made me question everything I thought I knew about warfare, Zexthara said. He took a long drink and set the glass down carefully. Let me tell you about the Battle of Proxima Station. The old warrior's voice grew quiet as he remembered. Proxima Station was a massive space facility. The Syndicate had taken it and turned it into a fortress. Our mission was to take it back. I was assigned to work with a human squad led by Sergeant Ben Parker. He paused, staring into his glass. Parker was different from Morrison. Where Morrison was thoughtful and quiet, Parker was intense. He studied the enemy like a predator studies prey, but not their weapons or their tactics. He studied their minds. How do you study someone's mind? The Mentari asked. Parker's squad spent weeks learning everything they could about the species that made up the Syndicate garrison. Not just their military training, but their cultures, their beliefs, their fears. Parker said that every species had weaknesses that went deeper than armor or shields. Zexthara took another drink. The alcohol was making the memories clearer, which was both a blessing and a curse. The main garrison was made up of Zolonian soldiers. Parker learned that your species has a cultural fear of complete darkness. Something about ancient predators on your homeworld that hunted in total blackness. The Zolonian soldiers' blue skin grew pale. That's true, sir. We have stories about the shadow hunters from the old times. Parker used that knowledge, Zexthara continued. Instead of attacking the station's defenses, his squad systematically destroyed every light source they could find. Emergency lighting, computer displays, even the glow strips in the corridors. They turned the entire station into a maze of absolute darkness. The old warrior's eyes grew distant. I watched Zolonian soldiers who had fought bravely in a dozen battles become paralyzed with fear. They couldn't function in the darkness, not because they couldn't see, but because their minds told them that death was waiting in every shadow. That's psychological warfare, Brooks said. Other species use fear as a weapon too. No, Zexthara said firmly. What other species do is crude. They use fear to make enemies run away or surrender. The humans did something different. They used fear to make the enemy destroy themselves. He drained his glass and poured another. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened after we took the station. The 3 young soldiers waited in silence. We had captured about 50 Syndicate soldiers. Most were Zolonians, but there were others too. Standard procedure was to process them as prisoners of war and ship them to Coalition facilities. Zexthara's voice grew softer. But Parker's squad didn't follow standard procedure. They had a specialist with them. Corporal Lisa Chun, small human female, looked like she should be teaching children instead of fighting wars. What did she do? The Montari asked. She talked to the prisoners. Not interrogated them. Talked to them. She spent hours with each one, learning about their families, their homes, their reasons for fighting. She treated them like people, not enemies. The old warrior shook his head slowly. At first, I thought she was being soft, showing weakness. But then I saw what she was really doing. He looked up at the 3 soldiers. Chun was gathering information, but not military intelligence. She was learning how to break their will, to fight without breaking their bodies or minds. I don't understand, sir, Brooks said. Chun used what she learned to create surrender broadcasts, messages that were sent to other Syndicate positions throughout the sector. But these weren't threats or propaganda. They were personal appeals from the prisoners to their fellow soldiers. Zexthara's voice grew heavy. She had captured soldiers record messages to their friends and family members who were still fighting. Messages that said the Coalition forces were treating prisoners well. Messages that described the food, the medical care, the respect they were receiving. The Zolonian soldiers shifted uncomfortably. That doesn't sound so terrible, sir, doesn't it? Zexthara asked. Think about it. Every Syndicate soldier who heard those broadcasts had to make a choice. Keep fighting and risk death, or surrender, and be treated with dignity. Chun didn't threaten them or try to scare them. She offered them hope. The old warrior took another drink. His hands were shaking slightly now. Within 2 weeks, 17 Syndicate positions in the sector had surrendered. Not because they were defeated in battle, but because they chose to give up. Chun had turned the act of surrender from a shameful defeat into a reasonable choice. But that saved lives on both sides, the Montari pointed out. Yes, it did, Zexthara agreed. And that's what made it so disturbing. The humans weren't being cruel or brutal. They were being kind. They were using compassion as a weapon. He stared into his glass again. I began to understand that human warfare isn't about destroying enemies. It's about changing them, making them see the conflict differently, making them question their own reasons for fighting. The cantina was almost empty now. Only a few other patrons remained, scattered at distant tables. The serving robot had dimmed the lights even further. I started watching the humans more carefully after that, Zexthara continued. I saw Captain Morrison make decisions that no other species would even consider. When faced with impossible choices, he didn't pick the lesser of two evils. He found third options that shouldn't have existed. What kind of third options? Brooks asked. During the siege of Kepler Base, Morrison had to choose between saving a coalition supply depot or rescuing captured civilians. The supply depot contained weapons and medical supplies that dozens of units needed. The civilians were being held in a facility that would be destroyed if we didn't reach them in time. Zexthara poured more whiskey. Any other commander would have made the hard choice. Save the supplies and let the civilians die, or save the civilians and let soldiers die from lack of supplies. What did Morrison do? He split his forces. Sent half to save the depot and half to rescue the civilians. It was tactically insane. He didn't have enough troops for either mission, let alone both. The old warrior's eyes held a mix of admiration and fear, but Morrison understood something that the rest of us didn't. He knew that his soldiers would fight harder for both missions than they would for either one alone, because they believed that their commander would never abandon anyone. Did it work? Both missions succeeded. We saved the depot and rescued the civilians, but we took casualties that should have been unacceptable. Morrison lost good soldiers because he refused to make the hard choice. Zexthara finished his drink and stood up slowly. And that's when I realized the most disturbing truth about human warfare. They don't just fight to win. They fight to prove that there's always another way, even when logic says there isn't. He looked down at the three young soldiers. Tomorrow night I'll tell you about the final battle on Tartarus, about what the humans did when everything went wrong. But I warn you now, once you hear that story, you'll understand why I drink alone. The old warrior walked away, leaving the three soldiers sitting in thoughtful silence. The cantina was nearly empty on the third night. Only Commander Zexthara and the three young soldiers remained, along with the serving robot that hummed quietly in the corner. The old Cytherian warrior had finished most of his bottle of whiskey, but his voice was still steady. Lieutenant Kelly Brooks and her squad mates sat closer to the table now. They had stopped pretending this was casual conversation. They needed to know what they were going to face in the war. You came back again, Zexthara said. Even after I warned you. We need to know, sir, Brooks replied. Whatever you're going to tell us, we need to hear it. The old warrior nodded slowly. Then I'll tell you about Tartarus, the Syndicate's fortress world. The final battle of the war. He poured the last of the whiskey into his glass. Tartarus was supposed to be impossible to take. The Syndicate had spent years turning it into the perfect military stronghold. Underground cities, automated defenses, supply lines that could last for decades. Zexthara stared at the amber liquid. The Coalition High Command gave us 6 months to take the planet. Most of us thought it would take 6 years, if we could take it at all. How many troops did you have? The Montari asked. Not enough, never enough. But we had something else. We had Major Susan Brooks working on what the humans called special operations. Lieutenant Brooks straightened. Brooks? Is she related to me? I don't know, Zexthara said. Human names are common. But Susan Brooks was unlike any military officer I had ever met. She looked like a teacher or a librarian. Soft voice, gentle manner. You would never think she was capable of what she did. The old warrior took a sip of his drink. Brooks didn't command soldiers. She commanded information. She had teams of humans who studied everything about the Syndicate. Not their military strength or their technology, their society. Their society? The Zolonian asked. Brooks believed that every civilization had weak points that went deeper than military power. She said that if you understood how a society worked, you could make it destroy itself. Zexthara's voice grew quieter. Her teams spent months learning about syndicate culture. They studied their history, their politics, their social structure. They learned about old conflicts between different syndicate species, ancient grudges and rivalries that most people had forgotten. He paused, remembering. And then Brooks began what she called an information campaign. But it wasn't propaganda in any traditional sense. What was it then? Brooks asked. Brooks had her teams create false communications. Messages that looked like they came from syndicate leaders. But these messages weren't threats or orders. They were subtle hints and suggestions. The old warrior shook his head. For example, Brooks knew that the Mentari clans within the syndicate had old disputes about trade routes. So her teams created messages that suggested one clan was secretly negotiating with coalition forces. Messages that looked like they came from clan leaders. The Mentari's antennae twitched nervously. That would cause serious problems between the clans. Exactly, Zexthara said. And Brooks did the same thing with every species in the syndicate. She found their old wounds and made them fresh again. She made them suspicious of each other. The old warrior took another drink, but that was just the beginning. Brooks also had teams studying individual syndicate leaders, not their military records, but their personal lives, their families, their fears, their secret shamas. How could they learn such personal information? The Zolonian asked. The humans were very good at gathering intelligence. They intercepted private communications, studied personal files, even analyzed spending records and travel patterns. They built detailed profiles of every important syndicate leader. Zexthara's eyes grew dark. And then they used that information to predict exactly how those leaders would react to different situations. They knew which leaders were brave and which were cowards, which ones cared about their families and which ones cared only about power. The cantina seemed even quieter now. The three soldiers could hear their own breathing. Brooks had a young intelligence analyst named Lieutenant Dan Foster. Foster could predict what syndicate leaders would do before they did it. He would study their psychological profiles and their cultural backgrounds, and then he would tell us exactly how they would respond to our actions. How accurate was he? Brooks asked. Terrifyingly accurate, Zexthara replied. Foster predicted that if we attacked the northern supply lines, the syndicate commander would pull troops from the eastern defenses to reinforce them. He was right. He predicted that if we captured a certain communications hub, 3 different syndicate factions would blame each other for the security failure. He was right about that too. The old warrior's voice grew heavy. It was like watching someone play a game where they knew all the rules, and their opponents didn't even know they were playing. He finished his drink and set the glass down carefully. Within 3 months of Brooks beginning her information campaign, the syndicate forces on Tartarus were fighting each other as much as they were fighting us. They were fighting each other? The Mentari asked. Different species groups within the syndicate began to distrust each other. Commanders started hoarding supplies instead of sharing them. Military units refused to coordinate their actions because they suspected their allies of betrayal. Zexthara looked up at the 3 soldiers. And the humans had planned all of it. Every suspicion, every conflict, every breakdown in cooperation. Brooks and her teams had studied syndicate society so carefully that they could manipulate it like a musician plays an instrument. The Zolonian soldiers shifted uncomfortably. But they were still fighting a war, sir. They needed to win. Yes, they needed to win, Zexthara agreed. But they didn't win through superior firepower or better tactics. They won by making their enemies defeat themselves. The old warrior's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The final assault on Tartarus lasted only 2 weeks. Not because we overwhelmed the Syndicate defenses, but because those defenses had already collapsed from within. By the time Coalition forces landed on the planet, the Syndicate was too busy fighting internal conflicts to mount an effective resistance. He stared at his empty glass. 60% of Syndicate casualties during the final battle were caused by friendly fire. They were so suspicious of each other that they couldn't tell the difference between enemies and allies. "That's brilliant tactics," Brooks said quietly. "Is it?" Zexthara asked. "Or is it something darker than that?" The 3 soldiers waited for him to continue. What disturbed me most about Brooks and her teams was how well they understood their enemies. They didn't just study Syndicate military capabilities. They studied Syndicate hearts and minds. They knew exactly which psychological pressure points to hit to make their enemies turn against each other. The old warrior's hands were shaking now. Whether from alcohol or emotion, the soldiers couldn't tell. The humans didn't just defeat the Syndicate. They made the Syndicate destroy itself from within. They turned the enemy's own social bonds into weapons. They weaponized trust and loyalty and turned them into paranoia and hatred. Zexthara looked directly at each of the 3 soldiers, and they did it all with such calm efficiency that it seemed natural, like they had always known how to reach into someone's mind and change how they thought about their friends and allies. He stood up slowly, steadying himself against the table. "Tomorrow night, I'll tell you what happened when everything went wrong. When the humans used their psychological weapons in a way that even they hadn't planned. When I finally understood the true horror of human warfare." The old warrior walked away, leaving the 3 young soldiers sitting in stunned silence at the empty table, each of them wondering what could possibly be worse than what they had already heard. On the 4th night, Commander Zexthara was already drunk when the 3 soldiers arrived. The bottle on his table was empty, and he had ordered another. His 4 arms moved slowly as he poured whiskey into his glass. Lieutenant Kelly Brooks sat down across from him. She could see that tonight would be different. The old Catherian's eyes held a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. "You're back for the final story," Zexthara said. His voice was rougher now, thick with alcohol and old grief. "Yes, sir," Brooks replied quietly. "We need to hear it all." The old warrior nodded slowly. "Then I'll tell you about the day I learned the truth about human warfare, the day that changed everything." He took a long drink and set the glass down with shaking hands. It was during the final battle for Tartarus. Everything had gone according to plan. The Syndicate forces were fighting each other. Their defenses were crumbling. Victory was certain. Zexthara's voice grew distant, but then something went wrong. A Syndicate counterattack caught us by surprise. Coalition forces were trapped in an underground complex deep beneath the planet's surface. No way out, no hope of rescue. The 3 soldiers leaned forward. This was the story they had been waiting for. I was with Colonel Peter Walsh and his command team. 200 Coalition soldiers trapped in tunnels with no escape. The Syndicate forces above us were preparing to flood the complex with poison gas. The old warrior's eyes closed for a moment. Standard military doctrine was clear. We could surrender and hope for mercy, or we could make a final stand and die with honor. Those were the only 2 options. What did Colonel Walsh do? The Mentari asked. Walsh called a meeting with his senior officers. I was there because I was the Coalition's liaison. Walsh looked at us with those calm human eyes and said something I will never forget. Zexthara opened his eyes and stared directly at Brooks. He said, "We're going to do something that's never been tried before. We're going to make our enemies save us." The Zolonian soldier frowned. "I don't understand, sir." "Neither did I," Zexthara admitted. But Walsh had his intelligence teams working on something. They had been studying the individual Syndicate soldiers in the units above us. Not their military records, but their personal files. The old warrior took another drink. Walsh's teams had detailed information about every enemy soldier. Their names, their families, their home worlds, their personal histories. Information that had been gathered over months of intelligence work. How did they use that information? Brooks asked. Walsh ordered his communications teams to begin broadcasting personal messages to the syndicate forces above us. But these weren't surrender negotiations or military communications. They were personal appeals from coalition soldiers to individual syndicate troops. Zexthara's voice grew quieter. The messages included detailed personal information about the syndicate soldiers. Information about their families, their children, their hopes and dreams. Information that could only have come from months of careful intelligence gathering. The three young soldiers exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand. But Walsh didn't use this information to threaten the syndicate soldiers or their families. He used it to make them see coalition forces as real people instead of faceless enemies. The old warrior's hands were shaking more now. Coalition soldiers began broadcasting messages that mentioned syndicate soldiers by name. They talked about shared experiences, common fears, universal hopes. They made personal connections across the battle lines. What happened? The Montari asked. The syndicate forces above us began to listen. At first, they were confused and suspicious. But then they started to respond. Individual soldiers began talking back to the coalition forces below. Zexthara took a shaky drink. Within hours, coalition and syndicate soldiers were having personal conversations across the communication channels. They were talking about their families, their homes, their reasons for fighting. The cantina was completely empty now except for the four of them. Even the serving robot had powered down for the night. And then Walsh ordered the next phase of his plan. He had coalition soldiers begin sharing personal information about themselves. Not military information, but personal details. Stories about their families, their fears, their dreams. The old warrior's voice cracked slightly. The psychological impact was immediate. Syndicate soldiers above us began to see coalition forces, not as abstract enemies, but as individuals with families and hopes just like their own. That's when I understood what Walsh was really doing, Zexthara continued. He wasn't trying to defeat the syndicate forces. He was trying to make them experience what humans call moral injury. What is moral injury? Brooks asked. It's a type of psychological trauma that happens when someone is forced to act against their own moral beliefs. When they have to hurt people they see as innocent or cause suffering that feels wrong. Zexthara finished his drink and poured another with unsteady hands. Walsh was forcing the syndicate soldiers to confront the humanity of their enemies. He was making them see coalition forces as real people with real lives, not as faceless targets. The three soldiers sat in stunned silence. The psychological impact was devastating, the old warrior continued. Syndicate soldiers began to experience what their own psychologists called empathy overload. They couldn't bear the thought of killing people they had come to see as individuals. What happened to the battle? The Zilonian asked. There was no battle, Zexthara said quietly. Within 3 days, entire syndicate units were laying down their weapons. Not because they had been defeated militarily, but because they could no longer bring themselves to fight. The old warrior's voice dropped to a whisper. The syndicate forces above us didn't just let us go. They helped us escape. They provided us with supplies, medical aid, even transportation. Soldiers who had been trying to kill us became our protectors. That's incredible, Brooks said. Is it? Zexthara asked. Or is it the most terrifying thing you've ever heard? The three soldiers looked at him in confusion. Don't you understand what Walsh did? He didn't defeat his enemies with superior weapons or tactics. He reached into their minds and changed how they thought about war itself. He made them unable to fight. Zexthara's eyes were filled with tears now. The humans had weaponized empathy. They had turned compassion itself into a tool of conquest. They had found a way to win wars by making their enemies too psychologically damaged to continue fighting. He looked directly at each of the 3 soldiers. And the most terrifying part is that it worked. The Syndicate War ended not because the Syndicate was defeated, but because their soldiers could no longer bear to fight once they understood who they were fighting against. The old warrior stood up unsteadily. That's the dark truth about human warfare. They don't just fight to win battles. They fight to change their enemies' minds. They fight to make their enemies see the world differently. He stumbled slightly, catching himself against the table. The humans are not the galaxy's greatest warriors because they are the strongest or the most advanced. They are the most dangerous because they understand that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but inside the hearts and minds of those who fight. Zexthara looked at the 3 young soldiers one final time. Never forget what I've told you. The humans are our allies now, but they are also the most psychologically sophisticated warriors the galaxy has ever seen. They can reach into an enemy's mind and change how they think about everything. The old warrior walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back. And the most frightening thing of all is that they do it with genuine compassion. They don't hate their enemies. They understand them so completely that they can make them understand themselves. He left the 3 soldiers sitting in the empty cantina, each of them wondering if they would ever be able to look at their human allies the same way again.